Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for our annual Biomedical Ethics Symposium. This year, we're talking about, the topic is Emerging Therapies for Orphan Diseases, Ethics and Economics, and we have a really amazing lineup of speakers, so I'm excited you're all here. Please note that we do have simultaneous translation available for the event. So in both French and English, if you look at the bottom right of your Zoom screen, you can see you can select French or you can select English, so you can listen in whatever language you prefer. I'll just ask Bernard to jump in and say the same thing in French so I don't embarrass myself too much.
Alors, bonjour tout le monde, bienvenue à ce symposium qui devrait marquer un peu un moment de réflexion dans nos vies, qu'on soit médecin, économiste de la santé, bioéthicien, représentant de patients. Alors, on a voulu s'assurer que ce message important, cette discussion importante soit dans les deux langues. Donc, oui, cette rencontre, comme Phoebe vient de vous dire, vous pouvez avoir accès à la traduction simultanée. Phoebe va vous expliquer pour la question des questions et tout le reste, mais pour ceux pour qui l'anglais n'est pas toujours aussi facile, vous pouvez nous poser des questions dans le fameux chat. Il va y avoir une période de questions après chaque conférencier, mais vraiment, ça se veut un symposium de sciences humaines sur un sujet aussi important. Et donc, oui, la discussion à la fin est clé. Alors, restez jusqu'à la fin, puis gardez vos questions les plus lourdes de sens et pour la fin. Comme ça, nous pourrons tous en discuter ensemble, encore une fois, dans les deux. Alors, bon symposium.
Wonderful. Thank you, Bernard. Okay, so I just want to start out with, put the French on. I just want to start off with a really quick land acknowledgement. So while we are probably all over the place right now, as this is a virtual event, it's hosted by McGill University, which is located on the unceded territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation. Although many Indigenous communities have lived in and continue to live here in Montreal, also known as Tiohtià:ke. So because you're probably in all sorts of different places watching this, if you're curious about the history of the land that you're situated on, you can look at native-land.ca for more information. I think it's especially important, given that this symposium is focused on healthcare. It's important to think about the complicated and often problematic history that those providing medical care and conducting medical research have had with Indigenous peoples in Canada. While much of this is in the past and there's a lot of great efforts to improve care and research, there's still a great deal of work to do in the present, as the recent and tragic death of Joyce Echaquan makes all too clear. So in terms of today, we're going to have 4 phenomenal presentations. They're each going to consider some of the ethical and economic issues that arise in the context of care for rare conditions. Our speakers come to this topic from a variety of positions as clinicians, patient advocates, policymakers, health economists. So we hope to have a look from a variety of angles. So each speaker has about 20 minutes to present, and then we might have time for 1 or 2 questions afterwards, but we'll save most of the particularly substantive questions for the end, when we'll have a solid hour to have a panel discussion with all our speakers. So when you have a question, either during the presentations or after, you can direct it in the chat to Iwaharossi, who I'll introduce in a minute, who's going to be our moderator. And before I hand it over, I just want to make a few thank yous. So a huge thank you to our organizing committee, Jonathan Kimmelman, Bernard Brace, and Iwaharossi, who helped pull this event together. I don't know a lot about this area, so it was really helpful to have a bunch of experts provide guidance. And a huge thank you to Heike Farber and Sonia Bichler for providing administrative support for the event. So thank you so much, all. I'm going to turn it over to Jonathan Kimmelman, Director of the Biomedical Ethics Unit, to say a few words.
Good morning, everyone. So welcome, as Phoebe said, our annual Biomedical Ethics Symposium. This is actually our last Biomedical Ethics Symposium as well. because the biomedical ethics unit is going to be extinguished because we are now merging with the Institute of Health and Social Policy, the former IHSP, which also is sliding into oblivion, to become a new department called the Department of Equity, Ethics, and Policy, or DEEP. Can't think of a better acronym for a department involving ethics than DEEP. So next year, there will be a first annual symposium of DEEP, and I hope that to see some of you there. So welcome everyone to the incipient DEEP first annual seminar here. And also, before handing the baton over, I just also want to thank our funders. This was funded by the Biomedical Ethics Unit budget, but as well by the class of 70, the medical school, McGill Medical School class of 70 gift, which has over the years generously supported numerous events that the Biomedical Ethics Unit has run, and they'll continue to support the work that we do at DEEP in bringing ethical discussions to hot button ethical issue discussions to various audiences. So thank you.
Great. Thanks, Jonathan. So now I just want to introduce our facilitator that we're very lucky to have, Iwaharossi. He's a philosopher who's thought a great deal about ethical issues that arise as a result of the inevitable limits to our medical resources. He's a professor at McGill, jointly appointed to the philosophy department and the Beeler School of Environment. He's also a Canada Research Chair in Value Theory and Philosophy of Public Policy. He's written countless papers and several monographs on topics related to normative ethics and philosophy of social science. And recently he put out the second edition of a book that's highly relevant to this symposium on the ethics of healthcare rationing. I'll put in a link in the chat so you can all check it out. But I'll turn it over to Iwa to say a few words, and then I'll introduce our speakers.
Thank you, Phoebe. Okay, so let me introduce some of the important topics in this workshop. Some drugs are very expensive, but there are two senses of expensive. The first sense is that the price is very high in the absolute term. The second sense is that the price is very high for what we get. Some central issues in this workshop are concerned with the second sense. So expensive for what we get. Imagine that drug X costs $1 million for treating one patient. $1 million may be seen as expensive if it extends the patient's life for only one extra year. But $1 million may not be seen as expensive if it extends 60 years. Whether a drug is expensive or not depends partly on the size of value and benefits we expect from that drug. The fundamental difficulty with orphan drugs is that it is hard to estimate the precise size of expected value. This is because there are many factors, but I only raise two issues. A, the number of patients is so small that data from clinical trial is unlikely to meet the gold standard for measuring the effectiveness. So that's one factor. Second, another factor, B, we cannot wait for 10 or 20 years to know the long-term benefits and effects of orphan drugs. From these factors, only two factors, the expected value of new orphan drugs is uncertain. Therefore, it is hard to judge whether the price of a new orphan drug is too expensive or reasonable or moderate in terms of value for money. For example, in England and Wales, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, NICE, does not recommend the use of many orphan drugs each year, precisely because the size of expected value is uncertain, and there is no basis for judging whether those drugs are too expensive or reasonable. Despite NICE, they have a very generous criterion of value for money for orphan drugs. For example, their criteria is like £100,000 per QALY gain for orphan drugs, as opposed to £30,000 per QALY gain for more common diseases. From this fact, many interesting and pressing questions arise. How can we control or minimize uncertainty about of expected value? Who should bear or share the burden of risk associated with that uncertainty? Manufacturers, governments, health insurance companies, or patients, or future generations? Should we have the same criterion of value for money for orphan drugs and drugs for more common diseases? Or should we have more generous criterion for orphan drugs? Today's workshop, I hope, will help us to understand how we approach these difficult questions.
Fantastic. Thank you, Iwao. Excellent. So I hope everyone's brains are bubbling up already. We're going to have a lot of interesting discussion to come. So next up, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Humira Osman. So I'll just say a little bit and then turn it over to her. So Dr. Humira Osman is the Vice President of Research and Public Policy at Muscular Dystrophy Canada, a pan-Canadian organization representing individuals affected by a broad set of neuromuscular disorders and their families. Her background, Her background is in clinical audiology, neuroscience, patient-oriented research, and knowledge translation. In her role, Dr. Osman has overall strategic and operational responsibility for all elements of research, knowledge translation, and clinical relationships and health policy work at MDC. Humira is an investigator at the Neuromuscular Disease Network for Canada and serves on the Canadian Institute of Health Research Community of Practice in Peer Review Steering Committee. She's currently working on 2 multi-stakeholder collaborative projects, a research study investigating the impact of neuromuscular disorders on direct and indirect healthcare resource utilization costs and health-related quality of life, and also a cross-Canada newborn screening initiative. So we're really happy to have you, and I'll turn it over to you, Humira.
Thank you so much, Phoebe. This is a great opportunity for us at MDC to be able to represent the patient voice, the patient community in terms of rare diseases. So we really appreciate the invitation and looking forward to sharing information on that rare disease perspective. So I wanted to really start off, as Iwa was saying, there are some challenges with making decisions for the rare disease community, and we're operating on a moving target as there's emerging evidence and changes happening at a rapid pace. For today's talk, I will really be focusing on really demonstrating the value around incorporating the patient and family voice and in terms of our existing value assessment frameworks, demonstrating ways in which we can lift the lived experience in these healthcare-related decisions, how we can build relationships with patients and patient groups to meaningfully incorporate the patient perspective in analyses and decision making, and emphasizing the need and value of incorporating patients and caregivers. I would like to first start off that Muscular Dystrophy Canada is a health charity, and our mission is to enhance the lives of those impacted by neuromuscular disorders. We cover a broad set of neuromuscular disorders, and we work to provide ongoing support and resources while searching for cures through well-funded research. MDC supports individuals in the here and now through our programs and services, and that can look like funding for equipment and assistive technology, transportation, housing, employment, system navigation, education, but also investing in tomorrow by funding research, which fosters advances in improving health outcomes and influencing positive change. At MDC, we truly believe, but also practice the principle, nothing about us without us. Now, this is a term you might have heard, and it was first coined by disability rights activists to really convey the idea that no policy should be reached without full participation of representatives of all stakeholders. And so once again, I appreciate that this panel, this presentation today, allows an opportunity to bring the patient voice. At MDC, we are able to practice on this principle or motto around nothing about us without us by honoring, valuing, and meaningfully incorporating the lived experience of individuals affected by neuromuscular disorders at all levels of governance and across different stages of projects. Partnerships is key, and today I hope that will be one of the key messages as we're looking at the way we value drugs, to work in partnership, work alongside individuals who are personally affected by these decisions, and intersectionality. In terms of rare diseases, we know that there can be intersectional components that can also influence the disease experience as well. So in terms of patient-centered decision-making, in the recent years, patients have become active in healthcare systems and research in meaningful ways. There are more opportunities to participate in research, to help translate the research results into clinical practice, to help with establishing services that can lead to better outcomes of care, to identify the benefits and costs, which often are missed from health technology assessments. As Iwa started off today, with rare diseases, there are significant challenges. Often individuals with rare diseases, like those with neuromuscular disorders, face delayed diagnosis, limited access to effective therapies, and many times decisions on market approval and reimbursement are fraught with uncertainty. So that was part of also the discussion, and my goal for today is, how do you navigate making these decisions when there are uncertainties around clinical benefit, value for money, affordability, potential adoption. High quality clinical trials are difficult to conduct in small patient populations. At MDC, we represent neuromuscular disorders that are rare and sometimes can even be framed as ultra rare as well. Natural histories are poorly understood. There is sometimes limited epidemiological evidence. So to Iwa's point, even making a case for who would benefit, what is the maximum benefit, to look at that value. So the therapies can be termed expensive. In many cases, they can also be the sole treatment option for conditions. And these conditions can at times be life-threatening or severely debilitating, impacting ability to participate in daily activities of living, which we'll get to. This right here is just a screen grab from a figure of a paper that was just published this year, again capturing, in terms of rare diseases, some challenges in health technology assessment as well. So throughout my presentation, I hope I'll have some of these key messages embedded. And I think a key message that I'd like to pause here and really have buy-in from all of you in terms of as audience members is, patients and their family members play an important role in reducing the decision uncertainties that we just talked about. That individuals with lived experience should be incorporated and integrated throughout that drug regulatory process. In fact, in 2012, Health Canada had a draft Orphan drug regulatory framework, which was really focused on providing Canadians with better, timelier access to orphan drugs and encouraging and facilitating clinical research on rare diseases. However, the way in which patients were to be involved were not well specified. Patient involvement is needed early and through all stages of the HTA process, from topic selection, scoping, examining evidence, appraisal, to really determine value. And we'll get to that in a minute. What do we mean by value and how are we defining value? In terms of patient-centered decision-making, over the past decade, a lot of opportunities have, as I mentioned, there have been more opportunities. CADTH and INEST have created opportunities for patients and patient groups like MDC to contribute to health technology assessments. This is really based on that principle that patients have unique knowledge about their own disease, about what the treatment can offer them, and this should inform the HTA. There was one study that I found where they looked at the CADTH patient input submissions and the subsequent recommendations, and patient insights it was found that patient insights are used by CADTH reviewers to frame an assessment, and they're used by the expert community to interpret the evidence. It was also noted that drug trials do not always measure outcomes that patients consider important, and we'll talk about that. Survival, symptom relief, the process of recovery, and maintaining health are all important aspects to consider when determining value during health technology assessments. So while members of the rare disease community have been engaged in a variety of roles throughout the life cycle of drugs for these diseases, there's still no framework for consistent and meaningful engagement for patient organizations, patient and families. And they often feel that the current levels of engagement are inadequate. But we have seen a shift. We have seen a shift from should we involve patients in HTAs? Can we afford to involve patients? To now to this call to action to present a situation where we cannot afford to leave patients out of HTAs. Not leaving patients out of HTAs is something that, as mentioned in terms of CADIS, MDC has put forward patient input submissions. When we do this, we are able to really leverage the trusted relationships we have with our clients. And this is a screen grab from one of our patient input submissions for a drug for spinal muscular atrophy, nusinersen. And we're able to connect with the community and ask about the impact of the disease. And what you're seeing here are some quotes from clients affected by neuromuscular disorders, and in this case, SMA. And you'll see that it can impact independence. An individual is mentioning here that they're unable to live day-to-day independently, that they face extreme muscle weakness, fatigue, pain, and that they experience endless tests and doctor's appointments while trying to live like every other member in society. It's impossible to have a true quality of life without treatment, knowing any day could be your last. Through these patient input submissions, we're also able to really get rich information on items, on outcome measures, on experiences that are not well captured in a clinical trial. As many of you know, in a clinical trial, the ideal setting is to have a really homogeneous population so you can really reach and see statistical significance in those clinical outcomes. What often isn't really discussed is how a disease, a rare disease, in this case, a neuromuscular disorder, impacts mental health and well-being. And you can see that on your left-hand side is from an SMA submission, spinal muscular atrophy. And on your right-hand side from another neuromuscular disorder that we cover, Pompe disease. Neuromuscular disorders, in this case, it is clear that there is an impact, and mental health is a huge issue. One individual mentioned that they have dealt with depression most of their life, dealt with discrimination from people in the public, and that there's a mental health impact of disease as well. These patient input submissions are, again, a rich opportunity where we're able to really demonstrate, again, the health experience and, again, potentially the value of a treatment in helping with managing some of these experiences. Again, here around work participation, energy level, fatigue, which might not, again, be part of those outcome measures that are part of the submission to CADIS and INES from the industry partner. Really, here is a point around really capturing or measuring what's important to patients. So oftentimes when we looked at, and when I looked at health technology assessments, we're really trying to capture value, trying to look at what that means. And at times you might hear for an individual who is accessing a high cost drug, you might want to expect some significant clinical outcomes. In this case here, you're seeing patients are saying at times slowing down progression, maintaining their abilities is important, and capturing that is an important outcome and of value to the patient as well. You'll also see that what could be important, it might not be measured on that outcome measure. In this scenario, what you're seeing is this theme that often emerges in these patient input submissions is on the potential value of the treatment to save costs, to save time. So a neuromuscular disorder can affect everything, 100% of our lives. Every day it impacts pretty much every aspect of our family life, how we plan our day, working full time, caregiver commitments and responsibilities, stress and concern for overall mental and physical health. It impacts our finances, emotions, everything. We are fortunate that he is a smart, strong-willed, resilient, independent young man. But the neuromuscular disorder still gets in the way in some form every day for all of us. You'll also see on the two accompanying quotes that sometimes individuals are talking about family members moving to the US to access the drug or paying out of pocket for expenses related to assisted devices, technologies to manage the disease. This work prompted MDC also really having these rich interactions and meaningful interactions with clients affected by neuromuscular disorders, prompted MDC to conduct work, a research study together with academic partners on really looking at the economic impact and health-related quality of life impact of neuromuscular disorders in Canada. For 6 neuromuscular disorders, what we have looked at is a $4.7 billion total healthcare costs and out-of-pocket caregiver costs. The largest cost category was around loss of productivity. Loss of productivity for the individual impacted by the condition, but also for the caregiver. And so this is important because really when we're talking about these high cost drugs, it is important to also note the impact on family members. And so the load placed on patients, caregivers, and societies can increase as patients progress along their healthcare journey. Many neuromuscular disorders tend to be progressive in nature as well. Oh, I'm on the French channel. Let me just change that. There we go. And so it's really important that as rare diseases can be costly with significant caregiver impact, it's important to incorporate the caregiver's impact into health technology assessments as well. Caregivers can miss out on paid work opportunities. There can be an increased demand on caregiving time, and it can also impact their own emotional well-being and can at times make them susceptible to health complications. Another quote that we have at the bottom of the screen, of your screen, is from a patient input submission. A disability in the family impacts everyone, not just those who have it. It shapes the way a family operates, communicates, jokes, and even sees the world. Not having one does the same, and knowing what was evaded also has an impact. It's not one person's life that is impacted, it's everyone's, for the good and the bad, the peaks and valleys, celebrations and mourning. So again, this is really highlighting the need to include family members, caregiver, utility values in terms of health technology assessments. So really, again, a key message here that I hope you're appreciating is that caring for an individual with rare disease represents considerable personal impact. There are societal costs associated, and this can contribute to the overall cost of illness and potential value. This information is important when considering the benefits or value of new treatments. I want to also take a moment to say, what are the implications of our current decision making? In the absence of a rare disease strategy, in the absence of having a strategy in place on valuing these quote unquote high cost drugs, what are the implications? You might have seen in the news that sometimes families often create GoFundMe pages for these high cost drugs so they can access this potential life-changing therapy or treatments. You're also seeing at times an implication of these decisions in terms of what we call postal code healthcare, where an individual in one province is being afforded a different treatment and health experience that is different than someone in another province, which is really well recognized in this first quote. I live in Ontario. My brother lives in Quebec. He started on a treatment with Spinal a year ago. This is very frustrating. I'm hearing that they're seeing improvements in my brother, and the Ontario government is saying it doesn't help. In this scenario, these are 2 adults affected by spinal muscular atrophy. INES had provided a positive recommendation for Spinraza for adults. CADTH had as well, but had limited the age. So in Ontario, it's on a case-by-case basis in terms of accessing that treatment. Individuals talk about jumping through unbelievable hoops to access treatment, and that can be extremely emotional on families as well. I really also want to highlight this quote. If children had access to this treatment, this is in relation to a gene replacement therapy for spinal muscular atrophy, early enough, who knows what the course of their life might be. Any treatment is a miracle if the treatment halts the progression of the disease. Again, really highlighting that maintaining disease progression is important. If it helps a person get a little bit stronger to hold a cup, drink it on their own, miracle. If it helps a baby who might have died from SMA early in life gain the ability to walk, miracle. Each person with SMA, regardless of their age, deserves access to these treatments. So what we're really talking about here is that there should be a broader shift in how we're making decisions for rare diseases, how we can really, again, have a structured discussion on lifting the lived experience so that we're incorporating that impact on quality of life, ability to work, psychological distress, mental health and well-being, ability to maintain self-care, independence, dignity. Also looking from that family perspective, looking at the time accompanied for appointments, needing to provide these informal cares and supports, and the out-of-pocket expenses. So potentially that we really need to redefine what we mean by value. And really, in terms of the concept of value-based healthcare is an important one. If we use the right tools, measurement, mindset approach, we might want to shift the way we measure the cost of the inputs and the total downstream value of the medicines as well. So while traditionally this is not taking into place, what we see through these patient input submissions, through opportunities to connect with the patient community, that it is really important to take the perspectives of added and potential for other elements of value as well. Moving beyond potentially qualities gained as a key instrument. This concept around value-based healthcare is emerging, and it is one that should be incorporated in terms of HTAs. Understanding the values and beliefs expressed by patients and healthcare professionals can really help to support the knowledge transfer that needs to take place. MDC was involved in a global study and a global project called Prefer. It's based out of in Europe, and it was a project that helped to engage patient groups to provide guidance for industry, regulatory authorities, health technology assessment bodies on how and when to include patient preference studies on benefits and risks of medicine. Really, the goal of what I'd like to achieve with this slide is to say that potentially there is also responsibility on industry partners to really measure outcomes that are meaningful to patients as well. Really looking at patient-reported outcomes in terms of the value of drugs. So measuring the full set of outcomes that matter is indispensable to better meeting the patient needs. It can also be a powerful vehicle for lowering healthcare costs. If functional outcomes improve, costs can go down. Sometimes this can be framed as a substitution effect. Oftentimes individuals talk about, if I had access to this drug for this rare neuromuscular disorder, I might not have needed to purchase those orthotics, or to have had a family member lose out on a work opportunity to support me with my activities of daily living, or to engage in a certain surgery, or to be hospitalized. This again is really highlighting that these healthcare decisions, such as when we're talking about newborn screening, introducing an earlier diagnosis can really also have some downstream effects and really be cost effective later on as well. This again is just from that whale study that I mentioned that was published earlier this year, really highlighting that this HTA agencies and stakeholders should really work together for meaningful patient involvement. And I would love to leave you with this idea, especially as we're talking about this in the frame from a biomedical ethics perspective. We really need to frame this discussion around patients being involved in discussions on drugs for rare diseases, but also decisions related to drugs for rare diseases from a health equity perspective. If we look at that equity and those two boxes, what could we do to really help to support access and reimbursement for therapies for rare diseases? So just returning back to how we started off with some of the barriers, I wanted to really also highlight that the rare disease experience for individuals impacted is riddled in uncertainty. Patients and family members daily take on a diverse set of roles and responsibilities, make complex decisions based on evolving or little information, all to ensure life-changing, meaningful outcomes. And I know and I see that public decision makers, HTAs, are also tasked with something in a similar manner, where they are making decisions based on evolving and new information, and oftentimes that's limited. I would love to leave this presentation with a few questions. Are we meaningfully including patients with rare diseases in decisions? How are we defining and measuring value? Evidence is imperfect. Evidence is changing. Patient perspectives are diverse. What are some creative solutions that can support timely and fair evidence-based access to therapies? And while I know that at the level of when you're making decisions around value of drugs, oftentimes the patient is removed from that. It becomes a cost-effectiveness analysis. I would argue that patients should be at the heart of every healthcare decision. And this is going to take an attitude and an approach shift and really doing what is right for patients. We need to value lived experience on par with emerging evidence. So I really want to thank you all for this opportunity, and I'll go ahead and stop sharing now.
Great. Thank you so much, Homira. That was fascinating and a really nice note to start on. So thank you so much. So for the sake of time, I'm going to introduce our next speaker. But people who have questions, you can always send them to EWOW and we can save them for the discussion later. So next up, we have Miriam Oskwi, an epidemiologist and a pediatric neurologist. She's director of the Pediatric Neurology Division at the Montreal Children's Hospital and a senior clinical research scholar of the FRQS with a focus in pediatric neuromuscular disorders. She's the principal investigator and SMA lead for Inform Rare, a CIHR strategy for patient-oriented research, innovative clinical trial network. Dr. Oskwi serves as an evidence-based methodologist for the American Academy of Neurology, contributing to clinical care guidelines. So thanks so much for coming. I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Phoebe, and thank you so much for inviting me to contribute to the conversation this morning. I am the one prescribing these drugs. So although I won't be speaking about the economics of that, I thought I'd walk you through maybe the last 20 years of what I've experienced and how it's shaped my views and how I counsel patients and families and colleagues using an evidence-based framework. So these are my disclosures. So trusting your inner Bayesian. It's important to understand how different people can view evidence, the same evidence, and come up with different conclusions. And this baffled me for the longest time until I realized that all our brains are wired based on Bayes' theorem, which essentially says that the probability is of any event it's not based only on the data that you're taking in, it's also informed on this prior probability or this prior knowledge that each individual has built up. And as clinicians, it's extremely rare for someone to have what we call an uninformative prior, which is a flat line. I know nothing about the disease pathophysiology. I have no hypotheses I can generate. I've never seen a prior study or met a previous patient. So when I see the data, I just see it at its raw value, and I have no kind of added bias within it. And when we practice evidence-based medicine, it's not just data-driven. We're not only looking at the data, and actually the art of it, and to do it properly and practice evidence-based medicine is that integration of bringing in the patient values and preferences along with our individual clinical expertise and the research evidence to guide individual decisions for each patient, not as a population, right? So we're talking a lot about spinal muscular atrophy, so I just wanted to say a brief word about it, in that it is a genetic disease. It's autosomal recessive, which means both copies of the gene need to be affected. And it's what I like to refer to as a common rare disease. So it's a rare disease, but one of the more common ones that we come across. And up until recently, it was the number one genetic cause of infant mortality. And the missing protein is the survival motor neuron protein, which is critically required for survival. So if you don't have this protein, it's embryonically lethal. It's a protein that is necessary for life across species. It's expressed in all your cells, but your motor neurons are especially susceptible to lacking this. And individuals who have spinal muscular atrophy have some expression of this SMN protein, and the degree to which they have it dictates essentially their clinical presentation. So there is a spectrum, but for the most part, kids are affected in very early infancy and most by early childhood. And the critical period that you need this protein, and I'm now trying to inform all of your prior probabilities of knowledge on this, is you need it during fetal development and in those first few years of life, and I would say even 3 years of life. And past that, you still need it. It's a steady state that may go up and down over time. But really, if you want to bring it back in and replenish it, the critical time period to do it is at that moment to see the highest impact. So first impressions. So when it comes to rare disease, your first impressions are often ends of one, right? It's a rare disease. Not many of us have met individuals with spinal muscular atrophy. And sure enough, during my residency training now over 20 years ago, my N of one was a little boy with early infantile onset SMA who lived in our intensive care unit. He had a tracheostomy to help him breathe. Family was not able to care for him at home. The intensive care team, the child life specialists in the hospital did their best to provide schooling and help kind of optimize his quality of life. But he then passed away during my residency, and he left kind of he imprinted that prior probability of, what the quality of life would be of infants with SMA who do survive with supportive care. And then I went to New York for a fellowship, and now it was funded by the Spinal Muscular Atrophy Foundation. And it was such an exciting time. We had identified the gene, the mouse models were being developed. I could see the mice. I could see some of the mice doing better. It was amazing. There were these drugs under development. And this understanding that, now we need to understand the natural history of the disease, have standardized functional outcome measures that are validated in this patient population so that tomorrow, when these trials are available, we know what we're measuring and we know what we're doing. So patients with SMA came from all over, and my N of one turned into an N of many, 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 and further shaped my kind of prior knowledge and probability of how these kids do. But we still had no disease-modifying therapies. So we had some who were opting for palliative care, others who were opting for more supportive care with non-invasive ventilatory support or tube feedings, and living much, much longer. So I got to meet teenagers with these infantile onset diseases who were going to school, who were speaking to me, but had significant motor impairments. And families were frustrated that at the initial time of diagnosis, when these decisions were made to offer supportive care, no one had actually really counseled them on how this would impact survival. So we went about to try to kind of state the obvious that, kids with SMA in these early onset SMAs are now living longer, not because the disease is different today, but because our practice of medicine is changing. And that's actually having an impact on survival. And maybe we should counsel patients appropriately. And soon after that, the first consensus care guidelines came out, and they were updated thereafter, bringing in all these elements together. So now with my reshaped prior probability knowledge for caring for this patient population, I returned to my home hospital, which has since moved. So this was the old children's hospital. But I returned to an environment that still had that experience of the N of one. And it took time to shift that culture within my immediate group, but then also across the hospital, so that when my patients would come into the hospital and be treated in the emergency room or on the wards or in the intensive care unit, little by little, I stopped hearing those whispers in the hallways of, what are we doing? And I struggled with this. I didn't understand, why is it that we're seeing the same data and we are having such different interpretations of the same data? So again, we stated the obvious. We did a survey, neurologists and respirologists across Canada, and sure enough, there was a great variation in the care that was being provided to these patients. We were not counseling them or offering them the same treatment options. And the reason for that, and here these are not high-cost treatments per se, but the reason for that was the individual person's belief that, sure, it'll prolong survival, but they did not want to cause harm. And so a lot of the qualitative comments that came about were value judgments on the quality of life of the surviving children if their life is prolonged through these supportive measures. So when we're talking about these high-cost disease-modifying therapies, I just want to bring in this kind of perspective that this is very new. This just really literally happened yesterday. And we need to kind of shift our thinking around how we're going to counsel these, and then also understand a little bit how our brains work and why we make certain decisions and why people have different opinions about what should or should not be done. So in 2017, this was just the introductory chapter on spinal muscular atrophy. And even back then, it seemed a little cheeky to say on the verge of a cure. And very soon after that, the first disease-modifying therapy for SMA was approved for reimbursement in Quebec, and that was nusinersen. And it changed everything. And I'm going to talk a lot about nusinersen, not to ignore the other drugs, but really, for me, as a practicing physician, that was the drug that really kind of was that pivotal moment of changing how we're doing things. So this, you know, if you told me when I was first in training that in the very near future, I would not have one, but 3 disease-modifying therapies that I could counsel patients for and actually write prescriptions for, this would have been my gut reaction. You know, this is how I'm going to feel about that. But in practice, this is how I feel about it. And this was my, if I had to put it in a picture, my experience navigating through this, this really was how I felt. So now, you know, we talked a lot about how we build up our prior beliefs and our prior knowledge about things and how that's shaped with our experience and things coming in, and how everybody has a different prior probability going into anything, including patients, payers, and different clinicians. Now I want to talk about the evidence, right? And how we should be perceiving that evidence as it comes in. So we're looking at therapeutic trials, right? So these are causal questions that we're asking, which essentially says, well, what's the effect of that treatment on the outcome? Pretty straightforward. And, you know, epidemiology 101, crash course here, but really what it is when I look at a therapeutic study, the first thing I want to say is, well, within that study, is it telling me the truth about the people in that study? So what's the internal validity? How biased is the study? So for that, I look at things about the population, who's in it, what's the intervention, do they have a control group, and are they randomized? Do people who are assessing the outcome, do they know what treatment group they were assigned to, and a lot of other factors that are taken into consideration. But there's also the precision, which for rare disease oftentimes can be lower because we don't have that many patients to recruit into. So our largest studies are, you know, under 200 patients. Very different from clinical trials in cardiovascular disease, for example, right? And the sources of error when you're looking at these studies who are trying to figure out, is there a causal link between that treatment and the outcome? Well, there's 2 kinds of mistakes you could make in drawing conclusions. One of them is just random error, and random error just comes from your power. So how many kids you have in the study, and are you actually able to measure? If there was an effect, can you measure it? The scarier one is systematic error. So that's your internal validity of your study, the bias, right? And this is where we want to make sure that the study is a placebo-controlled, randomized controlled trial, blinded assignments, allocation concealment, all these elements that we look for, essentially so that we're sure or more sure that the conclusions reflect reality. And then when you're looking at your evidence curve and you're saying, well, how confident am I about the evidence of this? Well, it would help if there was more than one study. It would help if those studies were of the lowest risk of bias possible. So, a very well done clinical trial, right? But in rare disease, again, if those high quality studies are not available, then you want to make sure that the outcome that's used is one that is really kind of clear. We're looking at death, and clearly if we've moved that over, that's a high magnitude. Or if you are very confident about the natural history of the disease, and that kids with infantile onset SMA, by definition, without treatment, are never able to sit without support. And now you're seeing a proportion of these kids sitting without support. Well, that's a high magnitude of effect, and you are more likely to have confidence in the evidence that's being produced. And then the other aspect that's also very important when we look at the evidence is its external validity. So as an example, if I have a study where I'm recruiting, again, if you want to design a trial, you want to make sure that it shows that it works, right? But you are more likely to then go and select patients to be in that trial who are, of lower disease duration. They are stronger to begin with. They have not lost as many motor neurons. Your ability to show a difference is much greater in that kind of very small select population. But a lot of times when these trials are done in these small select populations, in rare disease, the high unmet need, then the reimbursement can then come back to a much broader population, which is wonderful, because we do not want to wait for 5 more trials, and we do not want to wait 20 more years to know more about this, when I know for a fact that I have a neurodegenerative condition with no other treatments available. That being said, how do I then go from the study done in this small group of people to draw conclusions about everybody else? And where do I get that information from, right? So how do you counsel on an individual basis when you have these broader groups? And then the other things, of course, that come into consideration outside of the data and how good that data is, and your level of confidence in that evidence, comes about, what is the outcome and how important is that outcome? Is there a lot of variation in the preferences of these patients? If that recommendation, for example, was put into play, what are the risks versus the benefits of treatment, and I would say of not treatment? How readily available is it? And the cost. So to me, the cost really is just one of many, many, many factors that are important into considering when coming up with these decisions. And the cost, as Hamira very well outlined, is not just the direct cost of the drug, but also all the indirect costs to the entire family unit and the healthcare system. So this beautiful study. So nusinersen was the first drug that was approved. This was their infantile onset study. And, in the grand scheme of the hierarchy of the level of evidence, it was near the top. A randomized controlled trial. There was a placebo group. Good number of patients were enrolled. Right, you had 121 kids, and honestly, it was amazing. It changed everything. These kids were now, when for the longest time there was no treatment that could have possibly had any effect on a difference in their motor development or survival. These kids were now living longer, healthier, event-free survival. So not just because they were getting breathing tubes, they were living longer, breathing on their own, getting stronger, clearly had an impact on outcome, to the point that there was actually an early termination of the study because it was just not ethical to continue. So the placebo group in this study, I think, is the last ever placebo group for infantile onset SMA. So the next studies that came out after that, one on the gene therapy, the other on the oral molecule, all of these are now approved. All of them had shown efficacy, but it was not feasible, some would argue ethical, to conduct a randomized controlled trial for those drugs. So the level of evidence available for these other studies is lower. But does that mean that we can't make decisions about them? Luckily not. Okay. So they did choose the primary outcomes or important outcomes being ones that were, for the infantile onset kids, the ability to sit. So a huge magnitude of effect that then would drive decisions. So what about for later onset? So the older kids. Also a randomized controlled trial with a placebo group done around the same time. And they aimed to recruit kids under 12. Really, they were recruiting kids under 9 as it happened based on their narrow inclusion criteria. And they showed a clear effect. Again, clear effect, improvement in motor outcomes. So these later onset SMA kids, death is not, they live into adulthood. So what we're looking to change is a validated motor outcome scale that we know the natural history of in this patient population, and then showing that there is a difference and there is a parallel placebo group here. But if you had probed a little bit further, you would see that the magnitude of effect is actually very dependent on the age of treatment. So this is when some regulators got into the weeds of, well, this study was done in kids under 12, well, really kids under 9. So what do we know about teenagers treated or adults treated? Not very much. And then, well, let's look at the kids who are treated. And while the ones who are treated, really under the age of 4 are the ones that continue to show improvement over time. But the ones who were treated, after the age of 5, really it's more of a stability, maybe even a decline that we see. Does this mean that it doesn't work? Does this mean that I should not be using it in my teenagers? Absolutely not, right? And as an example, the oral molecule risdiplam also was able to conduct a placebo-controlled, randomized controlled trial in a large group of patients, in a much broader age group with individuals with more advanced disease. And again, we're able to show that they met their primary outcome. There was a significant difference in their motor scale used. For them, it was the MFM and not the Hammersmith. But if you were to split it apart to see, well, on these primary outcomes, the difference is actually quite variable based on the age, right? And if you think back on how I tried to shape your prior knowledge in SMA, you know that your highest need for SMN protein is in those early critical few years. And so the earlier you treat, the higher your impact. But it doesn't mean that you don't have impact when you treat a little bit later. It just means that you just don't know how to measure it. And so, this struggle of, are we measuring the right thing, is a real one. I think that death is an important outcome measure that everyone understands and everyone can measure. But outside of that, all the other changes are hard to measure. And it's so important to have that patient voice input in designing the trials and making sure we're measuring the right things. Because I can tell you that, if I have a kid who wears glasses and now he can finally push them up on his nose on his own rather than ask his mom to help him with it, that's a difference. If I have a patient who needs to wake their parents up throughout the night to help them reposition because they're just not comfortable and they can't reposition on their own, but now they can reposition on their own, or that they can hold the pencil a little bit harder. So now they can actually, write in a way that others can see what they're writing, or they can call out to their mother in the other room and she can now hear her. So many small differences that have a huge impact on their life, the life of those around them, but that we're just not measuring. endurance and fatigue being a very important one as well. And then I would even argue to say that, just how you view the horizon can be significantly different, right? Because as we said, there is this kind of rapid neurodegeneration early on, and then there's a stability, a relative stability, but there is a slow decline over time. So you're constantly viewing the horizon on the decline. And with treatment, just your outlook and your view on the horizon, just for it to remain stable, it is so critical. It makes such a difference on so many aspects. And that's an important thing to measure. So as a researcher, so I went through my path, and where now I am passionate about is real-world evidence generation. Again, for rare disease, now with treatments available, we don't have treatment-naive patients in the population. It's running the typical randomized controlled trials is just not feasible, and it's important to start developing patient-centered, pragmatic trials that then come and continue to answer important questions that can guide clinical care and also policymakers' decisions. So just a little note about Inform Rare and our initiatives there in rare disease. And I always end with this, and I can't not talk about it. But as one of the important things that I've learned as well is to be protective and very kind of conscious about what my prior probability curve is informed by, right? So I want to make sure that I don't have any financial conflicts of interests or other conflicts that could even be perceived as having creating a bias in my understanding of the data and guiding clinical practice. First and foremost, because I want my advice to my patients to be unbiased, but as well, I want to make sure that when my colleagues across Canada or the US ask for my opinion about something, that I'm able to give them an unbiased opinion. So I'm going to end there.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Auskui, for a fantastic talk. I can feel a lot of connections across these talks, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion. We might have time for one or two quick questions. Iwao, I don't know if you've got one in the chat.
There's one question from audience. Probably it's addressed to Humira, but probably also applied to Miriam's talk as well. But one quick question you can answer to is this. So there's an uncertainty about the evidence from clinical evidence trial. The question about what level of evidence do we value as a good enough seems key, important. So the clinical trials in orphan disease are limited. We don't have gold standard evidence. So the patient perspective input and social input needs to shift to consider what level of uncertainty in evidence do we or society tolerate. So what level of, evidence we can tolerate as a society as a whole. Do you have any perspective about that?
Well, first, we do have we do have gold standard evidence for several of the drugs.
Okay.
But in a select group of patients, right? And so when you make, if you're thinking about clinical care guidelines, you have some conclusions about your level of confidence in the evidence, but then it doesn't mean that you don't know what to do for all the rest, right? Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to practice medicine. So what you weave in are, I know the disease pathophysiology, right? This is related evidence that I can then bring in and then create a rationale to then make a recommendation. So you can definitely make decisions not exclusively using available data. I think it's really, really shameful if we set our practice around only looking at evidence and not taking any other things under consideration. It's just not how we practice medicine. I don't know if Hamira wants to add anything.
No, I know that was great, Dr. Oski. I would reinforce that point is when we're talking about the evidence, we do have great evidence that is emerging from these clinical trials. So we're not making decisions in absence of that evidence. We're really helping to lift, again, that lived experience, those patient perspectives, and making inferences, meaningful inferences about the value is critical.
Sorry, and if I can just add, we do have, I think, as a society, an obligation to continue generating that evidence. And there's debate back and forth as to whose responsibility that is. But in a setup where we have a universal healthcare system, and you can't expect all patients to have access to researchers and a research team to collect standardized data, it needs to be, along the reimbursement of the drug, also an infrastructure in place to continue to share that responsibility of data generation moving forward, and to do it in a rigorous way. There are rigorous ways to do this that are available.
Okay, so shall we go on and we can come back soon later?
Absolutely. Thanks all. So I'll introduce our next speakers. So next up we have Sylvie Bouchard and Isabelle Ganache from INES. So you can see we're kind of expanding in scope amongst our speakers in terms of how they engage with this, challenging moral and economic territory. So Sylvie Bouchard holds a bachelor's degree in pharmacy from Université Laval in Quebec City. She also has a diploma and a master's degree in hospital pharmacy, also from Laval, and an MBA in corporate management, also from Laval. She was a hospital pharmacist and hospital pharmacy manager, and joined Conseil du Médicament in April 2010, where she's held various management positions over the years. Between April 2016 and January 2020, she headed the Direction du Médicament. Since February of 2020, she's headed the Direction de l'évaluation des médicaments et des technologies et des fins de remboursement, sorry for my French, at INES. So we're going to hear a lot about their work. And Isabelle Ganache, so supporting public organizations in the integration of ethics, both procedural and substantive, is a dominant goal of my career. From 2007 to 2016, I participated in the evaluation of the performance of the health and social services system by updating a vision of ethics related to citizens and stakeholder participation. From 2002 to 2014, I've been a member and chair of research ethics committees, and I also have expertise in responsible research conduct. After acting 5 years as a member of the Standing Scientific Committee on Health and Social Services at INES, I became a senior scientific professional and now hold the position of Director of the Office of Methodology and Ethics. Since 2012, I also hold a position as a clinical assistant professor in the bioethics program at University of Montreal. So we're really delighted to have you both here and to hear your perspective. And I'll turn it over to you.
So thank you very much. It is a pleasure for Isabelle and I to be present. Thank you for the invitation, and also, it is important for INES to be present at that relevant discussion today. So INES is an autonomous government agency linked to the Minister of Health and Social Services in Quebec. We have a mission is to promote the clinical excellence and efficient use of the resources in the health and social services sector. We are about 275 persons now linked, but we are linked to hundreds of experts. The health technology landscape is changing. Next, please. So we are faced with strong willingness to accelerate the introduction of innovations. So often we think that new and cutting-edge technologies are better. There's a natural tendency toward an accelerated innovation process. So we are faced with rapid transition from idea to implementation, and then a quick transition to adopt without considering the challenges of implementations. So during the pandemic, we have saw a significant tension between the emergency of the desire and the desire of a rapid introduction for promising technologies, while sometimes skipping the demonstration of efficacy, harmlessness, and also value. So we are faced with different challenges. The classic HTA model often caught in a too early, too late syndrome. So we are faced with issues and difficulty of evaluation and appreciation of the value. So about the legislative context for drug evaluation, the Act of Innis specifies that the drug evaluation, for the drug evaluation, Innis does recommendation to the Minister of Health and Social Services regarding the updating of the list of medication for the public drug regimen and also for the health institution. And that act specifies that we must first assess the therapeutic value of a drug. So if INES considers that therapeutic value is not demonstrated at this faction, we send a notice to the minister. But if institute considers that the therapeutic value has been demonstrated, we do the evaluation about the following aspects. So we do first look at the fairness of the price of the drug that is presented in the file. We also do the cost effectiveness of the medication analysis, and we analyze the consequences of adding the drug to the list, or the introduction of the list in the network, on the health of the population, and also on other components of the health and social services systems. And finally, we complete the analysis with the advisability of including the drug on the list with regard to the purpose of the basic prescription drug insurance plan. Since 2018, we have published our modalities for evaluating drugs for registration purpose. So on the right side of that slide, you will see those aspects that are specified in our hack that I've just discussed about. And on the left side, you have the criteria with whom we work with our employees, but also with our different partners and scientific committee to judge or to evaluate, to cause a regard on those different aspects. So let's talk about, for example, therapeutic value. The two criteria with whom we are looking that specific aspect is first, what is the unmet need? So for the population that is under control in the trials or the file that was submitted by the manufacturers. And then what is the ability to the drug to confer a clinical benefit for that specific population or that specific situation? So we put into tension, the unmet need and the ability to the drug to fulfill that need. And we are going with all those aspects with the different criteria that are listed here. So for rare disease, there's a lot of challenges in appraising and decision making. So let's see. We are faced, and I will go for fast because the first two presentators were clear on that. But rare disease represent an important public health issues. The diseases are rare, but many patients are affected, and probably more than 500,000 patients are affected in Quebec. Rare diseases are diverse, complex, heterogeneous. They are chronic, progressive diseases that can be associated with a limited vital prognosis. Important impact are seen on patient, family, and caregivers, just as Dr. Oskui showed us. About the external environment, we see that there's a Canadian context to ease access to very expensive medical drugs. And there's also pharmacare that is in progress in Canada. So we have to take into account those different elements. We see that those challenges in pressing decision makers have different phases. So there's an unmet need that is huge. Where we also perceive delay in access to innovation to patient. On the other side, we see that the level of evidence is sometimes difficult to obtain. Randomized clinical trials are not always possible, neither they are desired for in some circumstances. And clinical data do not allow for assessment of value by conventional standards. We are also faced with difficulty in translating technical effects into meaningful and measurable results. And we are faced with a wide spectrum of uncertainties, and the assessment of cost effectiveness is unlikely very at high level of uncertainty. So you see that decisions about reimbursement are faced with difficult conditions. And we are faced also to ethical vision of those challenges. So maximizing collective well-being is in tension with the assisting the person in difficulty. So we see that there's a lot of preoccupation about the collective area, and then the personal or the specifying measure. So on the maximizing collective well-being, we see that the demonstration of modest effectiveness with low level of evidence, with high degree of uncertainty, is faced to the importance of that unmet need for specific people. And the desire to give the population access to potential benefit treatment. And on the well-being side, we see that significant costs associated with reimbursement are faced to the compassion and solidarity that requires exploring new ways of doing things. So we think that those issues must be discussed, shared, and deliberated, and probably that we will need in Quebec and more generally in Canada a real societal debate aligned with societal priorities. So you see that it's not a proper situation to INES, but it's a huge consideration. So how these issues can be addressed? So we have seen since the last years a paradigm shift in the kind of recommendation INES does to the minister to give access to drugs. So after a complex deliberative process, we have seen in Galafold and Spinraza for the type 2 and 3 a different kind of recommendation to favorize the access of those drugs. And within that paradigm shift, in our usual way to do assessment of drug, it would have been almost impossible to give access or to recognize the therapeutic value. Next, please. So we have used that promise of therapeutic value in a specific context, so in a rare or ultra-rare disease, when there's poor vital or functional prognosis, when we are faced to limited clinical data, and when those data are hard to obtain, and when we are faced to a significant unmet need. So we have favorable recommendation to the minister to give access to those drugs under conditions. And those conditions include the collection of real-world data. And the goal of that is to use those real-world evidence-based approach to be eventually able to do a reassessment. And being faced with the position that if the value is demonstrated over time, the drug could remains listed and then be accessible for patients. And if the value is not demonstrated over time, the drug could be delisted. So it's the kind of risk that we propose to the minister to give access. And then when the proof will be more clearer in time, we will be able to do reassessment and give a different position. Eventually, and specifically, that conditions that must be taken into account when they will do renegotiation of the drug. So I'll give the next to my colleague Isabelle.
Thank you, Sylvie. Another thing that is evolving at INES right now is the fact that we adopted last year a statement of principles and ethical foundations for a framework for appraisal the value of intervention in health and social services. So it's not an approach specifically for treatment for rare disease, but we think that this idea to take at the heart of the statement the engagement we have to appraise the value of an intervention from a global standpoint is specifically interesting for treatment for rare disease, because we think we can take into account the specificities of each object of evaluation, for example, disease severity, disease-specific treatment outcomes, economic consequences of intervention, context-specific population priorities. And we think this makes the statements particularly responsive to rare disease, while still maintaining its applicability across different disease areas. So at the heart of this statement is the idea of global value or appraisal from a global standpoint. And we think we should consider these different dimensions: clinical dimension, populational dimension, economic dimension, and also take into consideration a different element of context, organizational, or sociocultural, and we think it's compatible with our law, just stated, as Sylvie just stated. Okay, I don't know why it was not working. To change slide. So I would like to enter into a little more specificities about some of the principles that we find into this statement. So I'd like to talk a little more about the second one, knowledge mobilization and integration. The third one, reflexive multi-criteria deliberation, and the principle for fair and reasonable recommendation. I'll touch a little bit about the fifth one too. So the second one, the idea is to shed as much light as possible on the object of evaluation. By knowledge, we mean the information acquired through study, observation, learning, experience, including published data, but also data submitted, of course, the data submitted by the requesting party or data from the milieu, and also knowledge and experiences of relevant stakeholders that can be captured through consultative process. That's it. Yes, I'm going to be a little more specific in a few minutes. And we think that the deliberation, so we have committees that do deliberation about these recommendations. I think that the deliberation, it's when competing ethical dilemmas and uncertainties are taken into account to develop arguments for the recommendation. And we think we should consider the 5 dimensions doing that. So for the specific context of rare diseases, we think we should gather information beyond efficacy and safety. We think we should pay special attention to the promise and plausibility of the proposed technology, as Sylvie just explained a few minutes earlier. We think we should take into account with patients and caregiver what does it mean, the unmet needs, and if the proposed new technology is really addressing these needs. Sometimes yes, sometimes no, and sometimes it's not that clear. And we also think we should adapt the economic evaluation to the rare disease context, and take into account the limits of efficiency assessment, and also at the very least specify the cost and the budgetary impact of the treatment. The uncertainties, we have to take them into account. It's really important. I will be back on that in a few minutes. And also we should take into account different elements of context, the impact on the integration of the technology on the care trajectory or delivery of care. Also issues related to the optimal and relevant use of these technology. And also we think we should be open to an iterative evaluation for adjustment according to changing data, as Sylvie stated a few minutes earlier also. And so we should have in mind real world evidence, real world data, collect through collaboration worldwide in the context of rare disease. And we think it's key to progress. And we have to think how this real world evidence should be used into our evaluation, and we actively address this question right now. The fair and reasonable recommendations, it's principle, it's where we should be balancing divergences and mitigating ethical tension in the pursuit of the common good. And it's important to us to say that we also should, in our recommendation, precise the conditions and modalities concretely for a responsible introduction or optimal use. So if we're not sure the intervention work, how can we further our knowledge for the benefit of the patients? And also it's important to us to be clear and transparent on the arguments. Why are we recommending an introduction in these conditions or no introduction at all at this time? So taking into account the uncertainties. So it's a work in progress. So we have to decide on the relevance of public reimbursement. That's what our recommendations are for. We should explore alternative financing avenues beyond traditional modalities if it's appropriate. And it's beyond our scope, of course, but it could be in our recommendations. When reimbursement is not considered relevant, we should clarify expectation in terms of value demonstration. And as I just stated, we should propose modalities to mitigate the risk related to implementation and the impact on the care trajectory. Here is a slide just to give you a little more on uncertainties. So this is central to our evaluation. Depending on the level of uncertainties we see, our recommendation should be formulated accordingly. So when we have a weak promise of value, of course, we should go with no reimbursement recommendation. When at the other end, we think it should be implemented because we have the data and we are pretty sure it's going to be a good thing for the patient population. It's not that hard either, but in between, sometimes we could, when the uncertainties is high or we are not sure it can be reproduced, for example, in real world setting, we can adapt our recommendation only with research, only in research, for example. Also, we are really interested in these question of conditional implementation. Roughly speaking, we're talking about agreements that can take into account the coverage with evidence development, providing access to a technology while evidence is being developed, or also performance-linked reimbursement, managing the use of the technology in order to control its cost effectiveness in real-world conditions. The agreements, they can address the gaps in the available evidence. So when we can establish that, we can, in the corresponding uncertainty, we think we could sign agreement. Not INES, but we could recommend, and Quebec could go into agreements to help managing this gap. We also can estimate the value of reducing this uncertainty by generating additional evidence. And also we could invest cost, and uncoverable cost can be considered when we make a coverage with evidence development decision. Lastly, in certain situations, the possibility of obtaining a price reduction on the technology is examined, since it can have an impact on the assessment of the technology's expected value and the uncertainty. However, these when we look at the literature around the world on these agreements, it's not that simple. It seems to be a good way, and we think we should explore that as a population, and as a government, but it's not that simple. Sometimes it's complicated. Sometimes the cost is of the administrative burden is too big for the result we can have with these agreements. And all this, these issues of governance are not always clear. And all this sharing the risk with uncertainty embedded in the agreement, who is taking the burden of this new development? Is it the industry, the government, and then the population of Quebec paying for that? So it's not resolved. These are issues not completely resolved. So we think we should use these agreements in really with care, and with really reflection and fundamental reflection for every and each of these situations, and probably relatively exceptionally. In conclusion, I'd like to insist on the fact that fair and reasonable recommendations in rare disease, for us, it's a work in progress. We're evolving. We're trying to evolve in our evaluation. We're trying to adapt to the changing context, and we like to participate in the dialogue on the modalities of implementation, including conditional implementation. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much to Sylvie and Isabelle for another fantastic talk, complicating our picture even more. So now I'm going to introduce our last speaker, but certainly not least. So Aki Tushia is a professor of health economics with a joint appointment between the Department of Economics and the School of Health and Related Research at the University of Sheffield in the United Kingdom. Her research interests range from valuing and modeling health and well-being outcomes to incorporating equity concerns into social welfare functions. So over to you.
Thank you. Let me just get my screen sorted. Right, so my name's Aki Tsuchiya. thank you very much for the organizers for giving me this opportunity to talk about a topic that is not just fascinating, but extremely difficult. And I would like to talk, the title of my talk is A Health Economist's Take. I can't pretend to represent the entire health economist guild or profession, and I'll talk through what I think are the relevant issues here. And I have to apologize, it's from a health economist's point of view. The reason for the apology is because, as a preamble, we have, I think, all heard of this phrase, economics, the dismal science. And there are several interpretations of what exactly this means. But the one thing that economists bring to the table is the existence of the opportunity cost. Unfortunately, the hard truth is that we can't do everything. And it's the economist's role to remind people that we can't do everything. So the business of economics is about how best to allocate limited resources, where the definition of best is a crucial thing. Now, health economists are particularly dismal lot, even amongst economists, because what we're saying is that the implication of opportunity cost is that we cannot provide all effective healthcare, even if it does good to somebody's health, or even if it prevents a health harm. There's going to be places where we can't do everything that is technically possible. So treating a patient means another patient is not treated. Drugs, equipment, beds, clinicians' time, these are all limited resources. And unless it's like health information, which is a public good, so me consuming health information doesn't make less health information left for somebody else to consume. But things like this, drugs, equipment, beds, clinicians' time, these are non-public goods, meaning that every time we allocate a bit of these to a particular patient, it means there's less of it left for other patients to use. And therefore, the quest, the chasing of the cost effectiveness is not about penny pinching or cost cutting. We're doing it so that we can maximize the health benefit that comes out of a fixed resource. So the decision we need to decide whom to treat, but that decision always comes with, at the back of the coin, the reverse side of the coin, whom not to treat. And when we decide whom to treat, then the opportunity cost, so whoever it is whose health is going to be the opportunity cost of that decision, typically are faceless. And that's something that we have to remember. With that preamble, some of the speakers have already spoken about cost effectiveness, so let's move through this very quickly. The aim of cost effectiveness is to maximize health gain from limited resources. And it assumes that the size of the healthcare budget is determined exogenously. It means that those of us who work in the area of cost effectiveness aren't talking about what is the best or optimal size of the health budget. We're saying, assuming the health budget is given, let's think about the best way to use them. And there's, if you talk to people who haven't signed up to the idea of cost effectiveness and fixed resources, you always get the criticism of, well, I mean, can't we relax the health budget? Or can't we do things like reduce waste before thinking about cost effectiveness and rationing of healthcare? Relaxing the budget constraints somewhat might help a little bit locally, but it's not going to solve the fundamental problem that we are talking about, how to make use of that relaxed budget. It's always about how best to make use of a limited resource. One way to do it is to measure the health gain in terms of quality adjusted life years, where the very rough idea is that you have the product of survival and health related quality of life. And that measure, the quality adjusted life year measure, is used interpersonally. So a QALY to you and a QALY to me is given the same value. We assume that the first QALY to you and the 15th QALY to me are going to have the same value, and we're going to be able to add them. These are massive assumptions, massive and normative fundamental assumptions behind the measure of the QALY. And this isn't even going into the operational definitions of health-related quality of life, or the operationalization of how to measure those health-related quality of life. No, even at the conceptual level, these are quite, contested ideas, but that's the way we operate. One thing about cost effectiveness is that weak evidence base, due to small numbers, can be accommodated. And I think the previous talk gave lots of examples about how to go around them. And I'll mention a very, very stylized implication of that in the next slide. So the idea is to allocate healthcare resources based on cost effectiveness in order to maximize the health gain from limited resources. But even then, cost effectiveness is not the only consideration. So, for instance, the fair earnings argument, externalities, etc. So there are additional arguments, and I'm going to talk about them in the context of an orphan drug. So let's imagine an orphan drug or an ultra orphan drug, and they can be statistically significantly cost effective. So it doesn't have to mean that orphan drugs are automatically cost ineffective. At least there's nothing in theory that suggests that should be the case. If it's cost effective, it should be funded. Fine. It might be cost effective. The best guess can be cost effective, but not statistically significantly so. Well, then we can provisionally fund them and we can get additional information, or somebody can get additional information so that we have a better idea of the cost effectiveness. And I think there are jurisdictions, including Quebec, that apply a relaxed level of the significance, but still maintaining that it should be expected to be cost effective, but we can't pin it down yet. That category can be worked around. The problematic one is when we know for certain that it's not going to be cost effective, but there might be further reasons why we want to consider them. So do not fund seems to be the obvious answer to that case, but there still might be further arguments, which I'm going to start from the ones that are not intrinsically related to orphan drugs per se. So the first one, possible one, is the fair earnings argument for low quality adjusted life expectancy at age A, or it might be better to talk about low quality adjusted lifetime, not just prospective, but lifetime expectancy. So this might be the case. This is an argument that was put forward about 20 years ago by Alan Williams, who said, look, somebody tells you a friend died. And I said, oh, that's tragic. I mean, how old was they? They usually ask, a lot of people do ask, so how old were they? And it feels very different when you hear, oh, they were 85 or they were 25. And there's an element that, okay, all deaths are sad, but some deaths are more tragic than others. And the reason being that if you die at 85, then you've had a chance to be 50, you've had a chance to be 60, you've had a chance to be 70. If somebody dies at 25, they will have died without having experienced being 30, being 50, being 80. So the fair earnings argument idea says, if all other things are the same, which rarely holds, but never mind, if all other things are the same, we should take into account the fact that some people are dying without the prospect of achieving the same level of lifetime health. And the quality adjustment bit means that if there are two people dying at the same age, we might also take into account if one of them had a harder life, so if they had lower qualities. If they had a permanent disability, then maybe that should be given additional weight because their lifetime health has been lower. So there are arguments to say if the drug in question is for people who are about to die very young, or even if they're going to live for a long time, they're going to face very severe disabilities throughout their life, then maybe we should make accommodation. We should improve or increase the cost effectiveness threshold. And that's an argument that is entirely possible. And I think it's morally defensible. It's not always implemented in a very systematic and clear manner, but I think a lot of jurisdictions have this argument in somewhere on their agenda or horizon. Another one is spillover effects. spillover effects and externalities in the economist jargon that says there are benefits that are beyond the immediate one that you were thinking about. So the QALY just looks at quality adjusted life years, and we've already had discussions about whether or not the PROMs, the patient reported outcome measures that are used in the context of cost effectiveness analyses to calculate QALYs, capture everything, because there might be things that are health related to quality, that are related to health related quality of life, but are not captured by existing patient reported outcome measures. Or there might be measures that there might be positive impacts that are beyond health. They can be non-patient benefits, so allowing the carer to have health benefits or non-health benefits from the patient being treated. And these spillover effects, so effects that spill over from health or from the patient, and externalities, effects that happen outside of the service user themselves, can be valid arguments and can be defensible arguments for inclusion into the benefit side of the equation. But as I say, these two things, and there's another one, no alternative treatment. So if there is a condition where if the patient groups are denied a particular treatment, then they have nothing to fall back on. If that's the case, then people can make an argument to say, well, this particular drug, this is an innovation, it's the first one of the class. And when that happens, then it's quite reasonable to think why it might be it might currently be expensive, but the cost might come down. So you can remember all those like mobile phones and IT techniques and technologies, prices have come down. Laptops used to be much more expensive, prices come down. As the technology gets used more, prices can come down, and therefore cost effectiveness may come down. And if you think about that, it might not be right to make a decision based on the cost effectiveness while the technology has not matured in the market. And in that case, there might be an argument for taking into account the innovative nature of certain very, very innovative nature of certain drugs. But these arguments are not intrinsic to orphan drugs. It should apply equally to drugs that affect drugs that treat diseases with much larger patient size, patient groups. So it's not a particularly orphan disease topic or issue. There are possible further arguments intrinsically related to orphan drugs. And in the next few slides, I'm going to talk about rarity, identifiable victims, and the rule of rescue. So suppose a condition is rare or very rare, and there are technical definitions of the prevalence of how rare a disease has to be in order for the treatment to account as an orphan drug. Sorry, I think something has gone wrong, yes. So orphan drugs, by definition, relate to rare conditions. And let's assume that the weaker evidence issue has been accounted for. So we've accounted for the fact that there's weaker evidence because of the fact that the patient groups are small and the drug is still not making the cost effectiveness threshold. Some have argued that because the patient numbers are small, the market is small, so there's a small, the budgetary impact is small, and therefore surely you can squeeze in one small drug, even if each patient is going to be costly. I mean, some conditions are very rare, and surely you can squeeze one or two more in there. But cost ineffective means that there's a disproportionate opportunity cost. So we are knocking off somebody else from the list. Another thing to consider is something that Sylvie mentioned. Each rare disease is by definition rare, but rare diseases are not rare. So if you make a concession for one rare disease or one ultra rare disease, as a system, you would have opened the doors to subsequent rare diseases. So the small budgetary impact argument may no longer apply. But this is rare, this is exceptional, is an argument that you hear. We have to think about the moral status of the rarity. Does something being exceptional make it morally special. And one possible argument for that might be the identifiable victim effect. So the identifiable victim effect comes from this quote. And let a six-year-old girl with brown hair need thousands of dollars for an operation that will prolong her life until Christmas, and the post office will be swamped with nickels and dimes to save her. And that is the gut reaction of some people, a lot of people maybe, that says something must be done. But let it be reported that without a sales tax, the hospital facilities of Massachusetts will deteriorate and cause a barely perceptible increase in preventable deaths. Not many will drop a tear or reach for their checkbooks. Now, this might sound cynical, but this is it's a pretty realistic it's a pretty realistic description of how gut feelings work. So stronger feelings for identified victims versus faceless victims or faceless victims. And the issue here is stronger feeling. Does it translate into stronger moral claims or any moral claims? And the thing about feelings is that it compels you, and it comes with the feeling that it's the right thing. But you also think about when is it that it doesn't get triggered? And the places when it does not get triggered, are they not getting triggered for the right reason? So it's the same thing as asking, are they triggered for the right reason, or are they not triggered for the right reason? A further complication is when you combine the identified victim with imminent serious harm, it leads to especially strong feeling. Would that lead to especially strong moral claim? There's something called the rule of rescue that is very often wheeled out in discussions of orphan drugs, and is another quote: our moral response to the imminence of death demands that we rescue the doomed. And an example that is often used is a kid stuck down a well, or a ship is lost and you know that there are sailors in the water, or somebody is stranded in a snowy mountain. The imperative is to rescue. The imperative to rescue is undoubtedly of great moral significance, but the imperative seems to grow into compulsion, more instinctive rather than rational. So it's a quote that is, the rule of rescue is something that seems wrong to deny, but we do have to think about it. And the role of moral gut feeling as a basis of policymaking is, I think, the core of this, because it's there. We all want to save babies and we want to do the right thing. It's not that we deliberately want to do something that is immoral. We don't think that saving a baby, pulling out all the stops to save a kid down a well, a sailor who's lost at sea, and somebody with distress signals from a snowy mountain is the wrong thing. But still, to base public decision-making, especially policy decision-making, there's a strong requirement that decisions should be impartial. So public policy decision-making should be made at some arm's length with a cool head. So that you should not be done in an emotive motivation. The purpose of publicly funded healthcare systems is to improve population health and hopefully to reduce inequalities in health, given the resource constraints. So within or even outside of publicly funded healthcare systems, do people have a right to a long and healthy life? A long and healthy life would be nice. If we can't get it, have we been wronged? Now, obviously, there are ways in which you fail to get a long and healthy life by being wronged. But if somebody does not get a long and healthy life, does it automatically mean that that person has been wronged? In the context of a publicly funded healthcare system, do people have a right to effective healthcare? So simply, does the existence of an effective or possibly effective healthcare translate into people's rights to get them, assuming assuming it is the right drug for you, assuming that you can be expected to benefit from them, do we have a right to them? Or economists will probably say, do people have a right to cost-effective healthcare? Because cost-effective healthcare means that the displacement that you will cause is in proportion to the benefit you're going to get. Now, of course, this has to come with lots of caveats about the way in which cost effectiveness is calculated and derived, and whether or not those additional benefits that I mentioned are in there, should be there, are they appropriately taken care of? But fundamentally, I think this is what I've gone from orphan drugs to gone to an even bigger story. But do people have a right to a long and healthy life within the public healthcare system? Do people have a right to any effective healthcare? Or do we only have right to cost-effective healthcare? And so I'm going to end with a pessimistic note that orphan drugs can be funded. Of course they can, but not because it's rare. It's got to have some other kind of merit, which I have covered in the earlier slides. So I'm going to end with a list of my references. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Jackie. Amazing to have this development through the talk. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to our facilitator, Iwao. So just a reminder to participants, you can send your questions to Iwao, and he'll read them out for you. Feel free to send them in English or French, but Iwao, maybe you can send them to Bernard to read out if they're in French, but totally welcome in either language. And for our speakers, if you want to turn your screens back on, we're now going to have a panel discussion with all of you, so we can see your faces. All right, I'll hand it over to Iwao for the discussion.
Yes, I have actually one. Let me start with one clarificatory question. One of the audience have a question for Sylvie and Isabel about performance-linked reimbursement. So Sylvie, Isabel, the one of the audience asks the following question. I think Ines recommended the government fund real-world evidence spin runs registry. Can Sylvie, Isabel, tell us a little about that case? For example, logistics, pitfalls, and success. And if you have another specific example to share, can you share another case like real-world evidence spin runs registry?
Maybe I can begin, Isabel. Okay, so for Spinraza, we said that when we do the recommendation, we have estimated the population affected by the disease in Quebec, about 100 persons in 2018, let's say. So we said that it was possible to have more information about the introduction of the drug under that condition. So to collect data, not the specific on a specific way to have a register. It would have been nice, but we know all the difficulty that are around those the implementation of those kind of registries. But we have worked with clinicians, we have worked with the ministry, we have worked with RAMQ to examine the way we could facilitate the collection of data. So there was, we have had a lot of meetings and a lot of reflections, and we were on our way to implement first a sheet, so written information, and eventually that could be informatized to facilitate the way to collect those data. But there was something arrive unexpectedly on March 2020. So the COVID-19 have made that project on ice, and it's not yet restarted. On another way for cell therapies, we have also recognized a promise character for those kind of technologies, and all the problems expected at the implementation and the way it affects the trajectory of the services into of institutions. So the ministry has another way to collect those data. They gave that responsibility to a working research team to collect those different indicators, and we have had discussion with the research team, more precisely what kind of indicators we would like to see if we do a reassessment of those kind of therapies. So the ministry has put that recommendation into place, but in another way to which that is not still implemented for COVID situation. For the kind of recommendations that we can do, I'll let my colleague Isabelle talk more specifically about those, but we see that we are open to look at the files that are submitted by industry, and we still have a lot of communications with them to try to find a way to do our let's say economic evaluation on a basic basic analysis, but also in exploratory analysis, introducing the possibility that some treatment could be at the charge of the manufacturers, or if there's some expectation about the outcomes, they can be taken into account in our in analysis, and also open the door. We think that it could open the door to the negotiation part on that side. But maybe Isabelle, you can talk more about the different ways we can do recommendations.
Maybe I'd like to add a little bit on the limits of these conditional agreements. We are doing in Veille stratégique, a strategic overview. I don't know the right translation, but in Veille stratégique on these questions. We're going to publish it in a few days, so maybe it's of interest for you. But we have seen in the literature that the majority of countries have already implemented the conditional repayment arrangements. Primarily financial one, but there's limited evidence that conditional repayments arrangements can meet their objectives, and a number of challenges limit their operationalization. So it's not ce n'est pas une panacée. It's not an easy way to go, and Ines is not recommending this for everything all the time. Read me well, please. And but international experience points to some good practice for these arrangements. Judicious use, so for specific object of evaluation in specific condition, it can be interesting. Appropriate design, so we want to see in these agreements the right thing and specifically adjusted to the object of evaluation. An explicit governance model and transparency when it's possible, taking into account the limits of the law on that. So that was the first point I wanted to make. And for other maybe other way we would like to we're reflecting on is the landing strip. So where the fund can come from? Does it have to be from the health envelope and social services envelope? Because at Ines, and I think it's important to know that we evaluate, of course, drug drug and technology, but we also evaluate social services interventions and the economic dimension of these are really hard to tackle and they are really important to tackle too. So just we have everything in perspective at INES. So these landing strips are also an important topic for us. So where we are discussing with the Ministère du Développement économique, responsable du développement économique, and of course in our society we have to promote a good economic sector, a good pharmaceutical economic sector, but it may be not the role of INES and fund from the health envelope to fund development and research, for example. But it could be a social goal that we want to achieve as a society overall.
Okay, great, thanks. And then I have at least three questions. So, okay, let me start with the first question. I think this question is addressed particularly, not particularly someone, but I think quite relevant to probably Homira and Isabel Tilby. Question is this: how can the community change the perception of the value of real-world evidence in the review process of health technology assessment in Canada or Quebec? How can society can change the perception of the value of real-world evidence in review process? Homira, probably you are engaged this kind of process before. Do you have any insight?
Yeah, I would say that, real-world evidence generation, as Dr. Osby spoke about it so nicely as well, is critical. That as we spoke about making decisions on imperfect evidence, coupling it with knowing that it is a moving target and as information is evolving, if I just reflect back on what Sylvie and Isabel shared in terms of Quebec making a decision around providing Spinraza or providing positive recommendation for Spinraza to adults in Quebec, it would be great in the years that they have received access to that treatment that we would be able to generate Canadian evidence. So I think, Iwao, to the question, I would say that patients are eager and keen to contribute, but we need to build an infrastructure in place in terms of really making sure that we are capturing those meaningful data points and contributing to the ongoing evidence.
Great. Sylvie or Isabel, do you have any insight about that? No?
Maybe I think that real-world data or real-world evidence will give us more information, more precision about the way the patients and the clinicians are doing with the technologies that they have access, and it must be done in precise environment, and we must know where those data are coming from, and there's a lot of methodology, I think, to develop around the collection of those data and the way they will be analyzed. But it's for sure une avancée in the way we do our assessment for drug and technologies, specifically in a rare disease area.
Great. Oh, thank you very much. And then I move on to another question, second question. I think this question is addressed to everyone, so all five speakers. Given that they participated in the evaluation of the health social service sectors, do they feel that it is necessary for the ethicists to be evaluated as well? Do you participate in evaluation to establish your ethicality that would infer credence of the results of the ethical review that you did, and do you think it is important or not, and why? So I think question is, do you kind of, are you aware, did you discuss about ethical assumptions or ethical, frameworks or hidden ethical ideas or concepts underlying, data analysis in the review process? Do you have any insights about that? If you have, then please raise your hand and I will ask you to.
I think this one's for Isabel, no?
Yes, maybe. And I was trying to see what I can answer. I can answer a lot of things, in fact, but which one and in what angle? Okay, let's go freely. I think the discussion we have is just a statement of the fact that we are thinking about ethical foundation underlying our work. I would say that. However, I think we have a lot of work to do to render them really explicit at each level of our work. So it's, I think every recommendation, there are ethical, procedural one and substantial ones, ethical consideration underlying every steps of the work we are doing. But it's not always explicit. So I think the big work we have to do is to render this more and more explicit. And we do not need, I think, to use technical, philosophical, complex word or concepts when we're doing it. But we need to probably do it more explicitly.
That's great. Yeah, actually, it is not a good idea to ask ethical advices to philosophers, and we are always really bad make a judgment. Our job is to analyze ethical propositions, not like making ethical recommendations. So I'm really, in a difficult position to address this kind of issue.
Maybe I can add on the fact that these ethical foundation underlying our work are not specifically tackled by ethicists. Everyone is part of the conversation and part of the mitigation of these tensions we just presented to you. So we need every perspective to do a good job. And the role of the ethicist in that context, for me, is to be a mediator, to be a revelator, to name things and to render things clear, but not to be the judge of these decision or recommendation.
Jonathan, I think Jonathan has a question for Aki. Jonathan, are you there?
I am here, but for some reason I can't get my video to work right now.
Okay, so can you ask a question to Aki directly then?
Sure thing. Yeah. No, I guess I wondered that you might be able to better articulate the definition of the term that I'm going to use here, but my sense in the literature is that there's this notion of horizontal versus vertical equity, and that many times people make a case for reimbursing for exceeding standard cost effectiveness thresholds with ultra rare diseases on the notion of vertical equity, the idea that all people, regardless of the circumstances they find themselves in, ought to have some sort of equal command for some kind of attention from healthcare systems and resources. So I guess I wondered, what your thoughts are on this notion of vertical equity as opposed to horizontal equity. And in particular, whether there are ways that health economists are entertaining various ways of building vertical equity into their cost effectiveness or health technology assessment approaches or models. Is that clear, that question? To at least Aki,
yes,
maybe?
yes,
Okay.
I think so. Thank you, Jonathan. So the horizontal equity means equal treatment of equals, and vertical equity means unequal treatment of unequals in proportionate to the relevant moral thing, the thing that is. And an easy example is to say, well, okay, let's think about income tax. If you have the same income, then we want you to be paying the same level of income tax. And if you have different income levels, then the one who's got more income should be paying more taxes. And then whether you want to go proportional or progressive, and that's your ideology, fine. The immediate consideration here is, what is the relevant thing that we're talking about? So are we saying if the condition you have has a drug that is equally cost effective, then you should both get treated. And if you have a disease for which the treatment is not equally cost effective, then you might be treated differently. That's one interpretation, in which case what health economists are doing completely satisfies horizontal equity and vertical equity. But I think those who support orphan drugs making the argument has something else as the key variable that determines whether you and I are on a horizontal position or a vertical position and how to be treated. So that needs to be cleared. If the issue is, I think it might be need. So if you and I have the same need, then we should both be equally likely to get the treatment. And if I have a bigger need than you, then I should be in a more likely position to get the treatment in question. Then the next layer would be, how do you define need? Because health economists will insist that need is defined as capacity to benefit. So the maximum quality gain that you can get from your treatment is the need. But there are people who will think of need as the gap between where you are and where you could have been had there been the ideal treatment, which may or may not be enabled by the treatment that exists. So suppose there's a kid who's about to die at 1 year. You can say that the kid has 75 years of need because they're going to die prematurely. The health economists would say, well, what's the best treatment available? And if that best treatment only allows them to live 10 years, then it's the 10 years that is the need. So that's a capacity to benefit given subject to existing technologies. And then on top of that, health economists will put the cost effectiveness requirement. So everybody's entitled to cost effectiveness. So there's that element to be unpacked. On top of that, I note that you mentioned everybody should have the equal right to, or equal moral claim to be paid attention to by the healthcare service. I can't remember the exact wording you used, but that translates into access to healthcare services. Most health economists are consequentialist. So we would go on the basis of, well, what are you going to get out of that healthcare service should you access it? And what's the point of being able to access a healthcare service that ain't going to give you any good? So access per se will have very limited value unless it's combined with the health benefit that comes with accessing the healthcare. And so I think if you coin the one angle is how do you define the horizontal and vertical, and the other one is, are you talking about the allocation of access to healthcare, or are you talking about the allocation of healthcare resources with health benefits in mind? And health economists probably won't have much to say if the main interest is everybody should have access to healthcare. Because
just a really, really quick sort of follow-on question though, because it strikes me that when, in the universe of consequences in your answer, you have a sort of a narrow boundary around what those consequences are, which is that in particular, health-related measurable outcomes. But other sort of, if you can sort of think about expanding that out. So for example, the consequences of some people feeling a sense of disenfranchisement or exclusion and other people not, that clearly has consequences, right? There are utilities that are accruing to people, or not accruing to people who feel like they're shut out, and people who do have access, and those are independent of the health. And I guess I wonder, is that sort of, okay, now you're not talking health economics, you're talking something else? Or, is there some notion that the models that we use in health economics are not sort of capturing that dimension of consequences?
So I think the typical answer that you might get from a health economist might be that if there's consensus that we want to use the healthcare services to minimize that kind of disenfranchise or exclusion element, where we knowing that the opportunity cost is health gain lost, if that is the consensus, then there are analytical methods to accommodate that. And it won't be the health economist's job to decide what ought to be in the valued outcome space. And health economics as a methodology can tell you how to do the sausage machine bit, provided you tell me what you want in the sausage. The next layer is, well, okay, then whose responsibility is it to find out what is it that should be that go in the sausage machine? Some health economists have done work about what things other than health outcomes should be considered a legitimate output of the healthcare service. And the thing that we can't compromise on is when you elicit that when you go and talk to members of the public about these things, you have to make sure that there is the opportunity cost in the questionnaire. So if you say that depending on the way we run the NHS, National Health Service, some people are going to feel excluded and left out. Do you think that's a bad thing? Of course that's a bad thing. But is it something that we want to fix, even if it took away life years, average health of the population went down? Do we still want to accommodate that? That's the question that we need to ask, or somebody needs to ask. And once we get the answer, yes, health economists can tell you how to accommodate that.
Thanks.
Bit of a cop-out, I know, but there we are.
Okay, Bernard, I think you have a question.
Thank you all to all the speakers. It's been an excellent series of presentations and really insightful. Last comment by Jonathan brought forward one thing that I found was something that maybe was not stated enough, and I feel it's probably important both at the decision-making type of Ines decision-making to our decision-making as clinicians who prescribe, is that we're talking about vertical equity. I think we're all, in a way, biased, to come back with the words of Miriam, about vertical inequality. So in a sense, for rare disease, we all feel culprit that we are lucky not having those conditions. And in a sense, we think that the inequality, the fact that these people were born often with a disease that they didn't choose, it's just bad luck. And in a way, we need to do more for them because they had not as good a lot to start with. And I think it colors our decision-making at all levels, that we are more tolerant to say, well, we maybe don't have all the evidence, but look at the impact of this disease on other people with this disease, and let's do something to see if that individual will benefit to have another course, whether it's longer life expectancy. So in a way, it's kind of inverse pyramids. It's equality or equity, and then inequality, and in between. I think thinking of the world that way, it allows us to say, well, the example of Miriam, if someone can brush his teeth alone without having someone help them because of a drug, for that person who didn't get all the coins to start with, makes a huge difference. So it allows us to kind of balance what is unfair from the start, to say, well, we as a society are more fair because we're going to put more resources, yes, but we're going to put more resources to have, as much as possible, a higher quality of life for people who don't have our quality of life. So I think there's morality, but maybe it's a way to explain, and certainly I'll finish on this comment. That's certainly the way I talk about these really expensive drugs to the patients. I say to them, you didn't choose this disease. Many of them have paid their taxes all their life. And you shouldn't feel bad that it's going to cost the state a lot of money if it's going to allow you to stay home, to feed yourself, to roll in bed, and then make it easier for you to stay at home, and all those issues. So it's because at the beginning it's not been equitable to start with for you. So I don't know if it's a concept that's useful or has any resonance to the others.
Do someone want to jump in to Bernard's remark?
Maybe I can go. For sure, those kind of elements must be taken into account. The difficulty is not to understand those concepts, is to translate them in an economic model. And it's the tension we see in your comments, that we see the tension between the well-beingness of the society and the particularly benefic impact of a technology or drug on one individual. So it's the economic tension, and we see that the difficulty is there. And when, as Haki has demonstrated in a presentation, when we are faced in trials with results on progression-free survival or on overall survival, it is relatively easy to introduce those elements in a pharmacoeconomic model and to translate that into something more tangible than when we are faced, just like in SMA, in stabilization of the stabilization of the condition, or even with slowing the progression of the disease. So it is harder to introduce those elements in the economic analysis and to translate those in dollars. But in the kind of HT and the kind of works we do in our HT institution, the consultations of clinicians, patients, and caregivers are the key to understand the burden of the disease, the burden of the progression of the disease for not only the patient, but all the environment. And direct and indirect environment. Let's talk about the health services. And that's why we without any truly proof that the drug will bring benefits, not immediately, but in long term, we go with a promise of therapeutic value and say to the minister, we have to give access to that drug, even if we don't have all the proof that we will have impacts or effects enough for the money we invested as a society on those treatments, on those kind of treatments. But we will have proof in time, and we are not able to wait all that time to introduce the drug. So that's the tension. The tension is for us between the recommendation for a minister to give society access to drugs, and the dilemma that clinicians live in their office when they meet families with those kind of problems, and they have a face-to-face decision to take.
Okay. Yeah, Aki, would you want to add?
Yes, I was interested in the argument of innocent victim. So it's nice to say we want to give somebody priority if they haven't caused their disease. And in the case of young children, obviously they haven't caused their condition. So does it mean that we want the healthcare service to be judge of people's behavior? So as people get older, they make decisions. Some decisions are not very wise. Some decisions will lead to triggering diseases. Or the example I use is all sports injuries are by definition self-inflicted. Should sports injuries be put at the back of the queue compared to, say, things that are clearly not self-inflicted? Lots of things happen because of taking behaviors that involve risk, should we stop crossing the road? So if we want to give priority to innocent people, then we have to give low priority to non-innocent people. And I want to make sure that when we make that argument, we are clear that we want the NHS, we want the healthcare system to be moral judges of people's behavior. That is the implication. And unless certain diseases only happen to certain moral categories. If that is the case, then the decision can be made higher up. But given that lots of diseases can happen because of yourself or because of, sorry, I'm sorry, I'm not being very clear, but anyway, I think you get the point, that if you want an innocent premium, then you have to have blameworthy negative premium as well. And then the issue of, well, if you talk to sociologists, public health sociologists, they would say, well, very little health harm is because of yourself. There are social determinants of ill health. Lots of things are beyond people's control. Very few people deliberately harm their health. So yes, kids are very clear examples of innocence, but then, hey, I mean, it might not work is what I would say. Well, we have to be very careful. That argument is a very tricky one to go down, I think.
Does anyone have a view about that? Innocence, responsibility in, say, healthcare provision or rationing or allocation? I can jump in a little bit because my book on healthcare rationing touches upon this issue, the role of responsibility in healthcare allocation. I think there are 2 or 3 different views in ethics. One is that, we should hold, those irresponsible people, for the bad health outcome. So we should give lower priority to those irresponsible people, and we should give higher priority to innocent people. So that's one view. And quite different view is that they should be held responsible, but in different ways, not at the level of delivery of healthcare resources, but, for example, we should impose heavier tax on certain things like tobacco consumptions or dangerous sports or whatever. So one way or another, they are asked to pay higher fee for, I don't know, for governmental budget or whatever. So there are I think different view. I think, that kind of responsibility should come in the stage of healthcare resource allocation or in different ways. So I think in ethics, I think there are 2 or 3 different views about that. And then I don't know which one is more intuitive or influential. I submit judgment to you guys, but that's kind of state of discussion in ethics these days, I think. Yeah. Okay, I have one question for Miriam. The question is that, so you had that image of like a mud blocking motorway because you are stuck in the middle of motorway. So question was, what would you like to see in order to remove the mountain analogy in her road to treatment analogy? So from the doctor's perspective, what do you want to see to remove that big, huge amount of mud blocking your way?
So that mountain is made up of so many different things. The first was, well, it was the first time that I could actually go from, the typical neurologist who knows everything and can't do anything to now being almost like an interventionist, right? Like I can do LPs blindfolded now. So the drug being approved is one thing, but nothing else in the healthcare system changed or was funded to change alongside it. So although I had the drug, I didn't have the system, protocols, the access to space, so many other factors within the healthcare system that became, well, here's this added drug, but make do with this kind of very, and I am a deeply Canadian physician. I strongly believe in our healthcare system. But that being said, now even as division director, I'm ever conscious of the very limited budget within which we function, right? So if I want more nursing, well, who's going to lose their nursing? If I want more access to the OR, who's losing it? And if my patient is now admitted to the ICU, I know there's a surgery getting canceled because then they can't go to the ICU post-op. It is a limited system that needs to be, so it's one thing to have these drugs approved. And initially I was like, oh, fantastic. But then that roadblock is, well, this is now coming into this kind of very restrained system that then I need to learn to navigate. So it was my introduction to drug approval. My pharmacist now in our hospital knew me by first name. There is the aspect of now learning to navigate within the healthcare system, but then learning to navigate it really with no guide, right? Because it was the first time anything like this was happening in this patient population. Or, if you're measuring the right thing, so even our physiotherapists, so we have research physiotherapists, we were a clinical trial site, but the research physiotherapist is not the clinical physiotherapist. And then, is it the physiotherapist? Oh, no, they've now been diagnosed. They're in the rehabilitation center. Are they trained in those outcome measures? So that, that whole system for it to take off, and then it's regionalized. So if my patient happens to be, for example, in Montreal, and they're followed at a rehabilitation center that is equipped to, know the patient population, do these assessments, great. But what if they live elsewhere and they don't have access to that? And then now how do I measure the change, et cetera? So, these are just a few examples, but, to actually put it then in practice, it becomes almost insurmountable. Like and everyone was turning to me and saying, well, what are we going to do? How are we going to do this? And I'm like, I don't know. But beyond that, just having this kind of sense of responsibility that, well, now if we're going to do it, and if we're going to do it broadly, I still feel this kind of weight on my shoulders that we're so responsible for doing things in a systematic way. And it is our collective obligation to measure this. And patients want to contribute information. They want to move the needle forward, right? But they want to be part of that conversation. So that's why I'm so excited about the Sport Inform Rare, because now I'm no longer sitting alone in my office trying to think, well, what's important, right? I'm actually having the right people around me, and they can tell me, they're the experts. They'll tell me what's important. So we're measuring those things.
Okay, great. Here's yet another question for Sylvie and Isabelle. The question is this: should the level of funding for real-world evidence for rare incapacitating disease be same, more than, or less than funding for real-world evidence for things like diabetes, HCN, etc., which affect more people but are not as incapacitating? Do you have any perspective? So the required level of evidence for rare disease and more common disease. Do you have any?
I think the first question is, who will be paid for that? And comparatively rare or not rare disease, we think that for common disease, when it is possible to do phase 3 trials and have quality assessment included in the trials, because we just don't want to have results on different indicators, but we want to have results on quality of life. I mean, we want to be informed about that. But probably that real-world data collection would be more appropriate when there's difficulty to have regular trials that we are more avoir l'habitude de. But there's probably place for real-world data collection for different diseases in different circumstances when the outcomes desired to be informed are more difficult to introduce in that space.
I have a question for Homura. So Homura spoke of importance to measure the full set of patient-reported outcomes and the need to value lived experience on a par with evidence. I am curious about what work others see that may be particularly important actions to achieve this.
That's a great question. I think as Dr. Oski spoke about it, having patient partners participate in research at that level when we're demonstrating what outcome measures matter, what, even capturing that meaningful benefit or meaningful change is really important. And that's, again, looking back to, that drug regulatory process. It comes at all levels where we can engage patients and really have that input incorporated there. So I think that would be one strategy or a way where we can incorporate the lived experience and help to make sure it's on par with the emerging evidence as well. I just wanted to comment. I was reflecting on the panel discussion so far, and I think it's very fair, as Aki, you're talking about, if we use this principle around innocence or a victim effect, and then there's also the other element of it. I think often what I hear from individuals with lived experience, individuals affected by neuromuscular disorders or other rare conditions, is a sense of weight or responsibility. And Dr. Bray, you spoke about this, for the costs related to this, and even the fact that we're having this discussion, whereas individuals with more common diseases or experiences often don't have that weight, the psychosocial impact of accessing services or high cost therapies. So thinking about that piece as well, it really presents some challenges. So again, integrating and including patient partners in decision making is critical because they'll be able to relay some of these experiences as well.
Great. Now I think Phoebe has a question.
Yeah. Sure, thanks, Iwao. So yeah, one thing I heard across several of the talks was this emphasis on recognizing that the kinds of outcome measures used in clinical trials or the kinds of outcome measures utilized in health technology assessments aren't always the things that patients care about. So I just wonder if any of the speakers want to speak more to the challenges that arise when we start really taking seriously how meaningful it is for someone to be able to roll over in bed or push their glasses up on their face. Like when we really do take these outcome measures very seriously as meaningful, do we then need to take them and slot them into some sort of universal comparator, or can we sort of take them as is, even though they might look radically different for different patient populations?
The drug approval process does incorporate kind of feedback from patients and clinicians to interpret things. So in my experience, and I keep coming back to it, but death and survival, it seems like everybody can understand it and measure it, but everything outside of that needs an explanation. So even the standardized functional motor outcome scales that have been well validated in the patient population. We have good kind of natural history data on specific age groups for these, et cetera. And, so if you show it to a clinical expert who knows the field and you say, wow, they over 1 year in this age group, they made a 4-point increase, like, wow, that's amazing. But the people sitting around the room trying to approve the drug may not necessarily have this kind of prior knowledge of the importance of a 3-point difference at that age group. But they do make the effort to then ask, well, what does it mean? And there are efforts to kind of translate some of these changes. But what comes to be a little bit more challenging to explain is when there isn't a change on that scale, or when that scale actually declines over time. Yet you're still arguing that, no, they're getting better. That is where I think I struggle a little bit more, to be convincing that I'm still seeing a change, and then having some kind of qualitative feedback on what that change is. But what the dollar value, so this is where, I do not have the health economics perspective at all to, I'm not in the practice putting a dollar value over on individual outcomes, right? I have a very individual approach to, well, what's important to you? What do you want to have changed over the next year? And then using that, and there are actually outcome scales developed in Canada looking at, setting up patient-centered goals, and then initiating a treatment and seeing if what was important to that particular patient was put in place with the treatment over time. I don't know if Sylvie or Miriam want to add to that. I know Aki does.
Yeah, Aki, please.
I'm not completely properly informed about the Canadian or the Quebecois system, but if we talk about the QALY, then we have to translate that patient experience into some stylized description that can be valued by members of the public who have no idea about the condition, not in terms of translating into dollars or pounds, but into life years. So the typical health state valuation exercise says, if you were to live in this state for 10 years, would you rather live for a shorter duration in full health? So it's converting that improvement in quality of life into the equivalent numbers of years in full health. And so there's several challenges. One is, how do you end up with it? How do you agree on the list of items that need valuing, or how many aspects? So being able to push up the glasses up your nose is very unlikely to make the list of things that would be valued. And then the second one is, as long as you have general public values as opposed to patient values, then how are you going to convert that? No. There is evidence to say that if you give the respondents more information generated by the patients, it changes the values. So rather than to give dry descriptions of like moderate difficulty walking about, you try to give them information that comes from patients about what it means if you have problems walking about. So that kind of challenge. And there's a big debate in health economics about whether the values, the quality of life values, should come from patients who know the disease, but only one condition, and patients general public who don't know about any of the conditions, because we need the QALYs to be generalizable across all different conditions. So if you have a patient who knows very well about a respiratory condition, they might not know a lot about a mental health condition. And so there's challenges. And while I've got the microphone, if I may add to Miriam's point about how do you justify no improvement or even slight decrement, the way trials are set up ideally should be, okay, I think it goes back to the natural history point that you made, that if the natural history were known, so that you know that the kids are going to deteriorate without the drug, and you show that with the drug they stay stable, then that is a completely legitimate measure of benefit from the drug. Of course, I appreciate it's going to be a challenge if you don't have the description without the disease, or without the drug, or with another conventional drug. But sorry, I'm making 2 points. I'm hogging the microphone for too long.
Someone who's not on the other panel, on the group here, but is in the audience. I don't know if the audience is allowed to unmute, or if Chris McCabe wants to say anything about this, but I would love to hear his perspective on this, if that's at all possible. Sorry to put you on the spot, but
so Phoebe, can you see that?
I don't know. Stu, is that possible? I'm not doing that.
But in the interim, maybe Madame Bouchard can.
So if someone can raise a hand amongst audience, probably we can.
I'm so sorry, Chris.
No, I was trying to skulk in the background. I don't have a lot to add beyond Aki's observation. I think the problem is establishing the natural history. And I remember when we were working on Gaucher's back in about 2002, 2003, literally hand transcribing data from 10 and 15 patient natural history reports from the literature in the 60s, the 70s and 80s in order to be able to model the natural history. And obviously with many diseases, even that data isn't available, relatively recently defined conditions. That's highly problematic. So I think that's where we get into the role of real world evidence and prospective real world evidence alongside the clinical trials. I think that the solution lies in having a complementary real world evidence data capture activity that runs alongside the clinical trial program. And regulators need to require that instead of just saying, yes, we'll let you have a small trial and we'll approve at the end of phase 1 or phase 2. When they're agreeing to those, they should be saying, but in order for this to be meaningful, you need to go out and get natural history data in the places where you're not, for probably infrastructure reasons, going to be able to run trials of your therapy. You could probably capture, identify patients and at least capture the natural history data. So I think regulators need to understand that they've got a role here to help us with the very significant natural history problem. Anyway, I'm going to go and skulk back in the background again now.
Okay, that's great. Thanks. So probably there's, I think, Jonathan, you have a chance to ask the second question.
Sure. First of all, let me just say what a treat to see Chris in the audience. Anyway, I'm so glad he could attend. So I actually have lots of questions. I could go all day, but I'm going to pick one of my 2 questions that I sent Iwao. One thing that hasn't really come up yet in the discussion is this notion of innovation premium. So if you think about SMA, nusinersen it's a fairly innovative product. It's, I think, one of the first or one of the earliest. I think it's an exon skipping oligo, as I recall, or
antisense oligonucleotide.
It's antisense. Okay, so it's one of the first. I think it's probably the first antisense that's been used successfully in pediatric neurology, much less in neurology, period, to my knowledge. And I know that there's some discussion in health economics about this notion of innovation premiums that because there are these spillover effects that redound to healthcare systems from highly innovative products, that there ought to be a more permissive threshold for reimbursing those products than products that are basically new compounds that are working by the exact same mechanism that aren't necessarily going to lead to other forms of innovation. And so I guess I just sort of wanted to hear maybe the perspective both of Aki especially and maybe of Ines about this notion of innovation premiums. Number one, is this a notion that people are thinking about or are incorporating into health technology assessment? And number two, how do you sort of draw the boundaries and define what is innovative? How do you get a sort of a meaningful notion of innovativeness? Because everyone's going to say their product is innovative.
Isabelle, you want to go?
I'm smiling. The question of innovation it's an ongoing discussion at INES and with external collaborators, I would say. To my perspective, I think we need to separate the act of evaluation and the act of promotion of innovation. Even if when we evaluate favorably something, it can promote the introduction of innovation in the system. And as a citizen, as I stated earlier, I am happy to have a good economic sector and to promote it. But to me, the act of evaluation is different from the act of promotion of innovation. However, I think we need to be part of this conversation. And we can act as an evaluator at different moments in the cycle of an innovation, for example, cycle of life. So we can evaluate earlier an innovation to give an advice on the plausibility of interest, the need that it could help to address, and then do our work of evaluators later in the cycle of life of the innovation and say yes or no. We have the data to say it could be introduced in the system. So I don't know if you want to add something, Sylvie.
I think the translation of innovation in the way we do our assessment is uncertainty, because when we are faced to a new mechanism of action, a new class of drug, a new way to manage the health services or health sustain activities in the trajectory of the patient, it induces uncertainties that we have to take into account. And sometimes we're not translate that uncertainties. We do not translate that uncertainties not only in economic way, but in a qualitative way to argument, to bring an argument to the to the minister, say we are not completely. There's a lot of uncertainties. We're not completely convinced that drug will do the promise of those benefits in our society, but we probably have to take not a chance, but to give a chance to the drug to bring more information in the real life circumstances. But those elements must have to be more delimited, more explicit. And it's there's the assessment way for illness, and then there's a political reason or economic reason or different. I'll stay with the term of political reason for the minister to give or not access to a drug. So we have to bring separation or a delimitation with what we can do in the assessment and how to implement those kind of technologies with all the uncertainties that the technology brings.
Right.
Okay, great. Phoebe.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, our time has already come to an end. I feel like that was an incredibly fast 3 hours. But I just want to extend another enormous thank you to our organizing committee, absolutely to our speakers who've been tremendous, our facilitator, Iwao, and a couple behind the scenes thank you. So you may not have seen them, but we've had two phenomenal translators with us today, Pierre and Sophia, who've been working very hard. And we also have Stu and Jonathan, who've been helping with all the technical aspects of facilitating the Zoom and the translation. So an enormous thank you to them. And thanks to our participants for your great questions, for making this a really interesting discussion. So that's it for today. Thank you everyone for joining. And this will be posted on YouTube later for those who want to watch it.
Hi, everyone.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much.